The pizza delivery. Arjun Mehra tightened his grip on his delivery bike's handlebars as he navigated the bustling, worn-out streets of Milltown. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over cracked sidewalks, flickering street lamps, and graffiti-streaked walls. Milltown, once a vibrant neighborhood, now felt heavy with neglect, each corner like a ghostly reminder of better days. This delivery, his last of the day, was for 357 Maple Street, a location that hadn't come up on his route before. As he pedaled further from the bustling downtown into the quieter, desolate blocks, he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Arjun's mother's voice echoed in his mind. She'd been his biggest supporter, even as her health declined, and he knew that the bills piling up at home made this job essential. He couldn't afford to lose it. Today was his first day at Franco's Pizzeria, and he was determined to make a good impression, even if that meant delivering to this eerily quiet area. After a few more minutes of biking, Arjun finally spotted the house, 357 Maple Street. The building was dilapidated, its paint chipping off in layers, revealing the gray bones of old wood underneath. Tall weeds and wildflowers, untamed and abandoned, framed the broken path leading to the front door. The whole place felt frozen in time, like a photograph of a family home that had long since been forgotten. Arjun took a deep breath, hoping to steady himself. His manager Gerald's warning echoed in his mind. Just deliver and go. Don't ask questions. Gerald had been unusually stern about this address, and though he hadn't shared details, his tone was enough to unsettle Arjun. With the warm pizza box tucked securely under his arm, he made his way up the cracked stone steps and knocked softly on the door. The door creaked open, and a young girl appeared. She looked to be around 9 or 10, her frail figure standing awkwardly behind the partially open door. Her clothes were worn and mismatched, her hair disheveled as if she hadn't brushed it in days. But it was her eyes that held Arjun's attention. They seemed to carry an overwhelming sadness, mixed with a hint of fear. "Hi there," Arjun said gently, offering a small smile. "I have a pizza delivery for Sophie." The girl gave a hesitant nod, her gaze darting down to the floor as if she was ashamed to look him in the eyes. As she reached out to take the box, Arjun noticed her small hands trembling slightly. Something dark and dried covered her fingers. Arjun tried not to stare, but it looked almost like blood. Are you okay?" he asked, keeping his tone soft. Sophie nodded quickly but avoided meeting his gaze. The silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the faint sound of a distant car passing by. After a moment, she whispered, "Thank you," and turned to close the door. As she did, a strange smell wafted out, a pungent mixture of bleach and something metallic, underlined by a musty, earthy odor. Arjun instinctively took a step back, trying to hold his breath. Whatever the smell was, it wasn't something you'd expect from a family home. Sophie," he began, feeling an inexplicable urge to help despite Gerald's warning. But before he could ask more, she shut the door quietly but firmly, leaving Arjun standing alone on the porch, a gnawing feeling of unease churning in his stomach. Arjun turned to leave, but as he glanced over his shoulder, he noticed movement in the window of the neighboring house. An elderly man stood there, his expression as blank and unmoving as a statue. His eyes bore into Arjun with an unsettling intensity, watching him as though he were an unwelcome intruder. Arjun hesitated, considering whether to approach the man and ask if he knew anything about the girl or her family. But Gerald's warning echoed again in his mind. Just delivering and go. His job was on the line, and getting involved might risk more than he could handle. With a heavy sigh, he mounted his bike, glancing back at the house one last time. The feeling that he was leaving something important behind lingered, but he forced himself to pedal away. The ride back to Franco's Pizzeria was a blur. Arjun couldn't shake the girl's face from his mind, her weary eyes and trembling hands. He tried to brush it off, convincing himself he was overthinking it. But the image of her blood-stained fingers and the strange smell still haunted him. He could almost feel the weight of her fear pressing against his conscience, urging him to do something, anything, to help her. As he pulled into the pizzeria's parking lot, Gerald was on the phone, his brow furrowed. The second he saw Arjun, he ended the call and approached him, his usual stern expression softening just slightly. "How was the delivery?" Gerald asked, a hint of curiosity in his tone. Arjun hesitated, unsure of how much to share. I delivered it to a young girl. Her name was Sophie, I think." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "A girl? Huh. Was she alone?" Arjun nodded, then added, "There was something strange about the place. She looked scared, and the house didn't feel right. There was this smell, bleach and something else, something metallic." Gerald's face went dark, and he sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Look, Arjun," he said after a moment, "it's not our business. There are some things in this neighborhood that are better left alone. People deal with stuff in their own ways, and it's not for us to judge. Just keep doing your job, understand?" Arjun nodded slowly, but the unease remained. The girl's face, her quiet plea for help hidden behind her fearful eyes, refused to fade from his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something that no one else was supposed to see, something he wasn't sure he could ignore. As Arjun left the pizzeria that night, he couldn't help but look back towards Maple Street, the darkened outline of the desolate neighborhood lurking at the edge of his vision. A nagging feeling told him that this was far from over, that whatever he had seen today would pull him back to that house sooner than he realized. And as he lay in bed that night, haunted by the memory of Sophie's trembling hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been given a glimpse into a life far more broken than his own. A life that perhaps, somehow, he was meant to help mend. A second visit. The next day dawned gray and heavy, clouds gathering ominously over Milltown as if reflecting the uneasy weight in Arjun's chest. The streets were alive with the usual sounds of a weekday morning: honking cars, muffled conversations, and a persistent hum of the city. But Arjun felt strangely isolated, his mind replaying yesterday's delivery over and over. He hadn't been able to sleep, haunted by the image of the young girl and the dilapidated house. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her small, blood-stained hands clutching the pizza box, her haunted eyes refusing to meet his. The pungent smell of bleach and decay lingered in his nostrils as if it had followed him home, a relentless reminder of what he'd left behind. Arjun couldn't ignore the pull to return to Maple Street, but what could he do? Gerald had made it clear that delivering pizza was his only responsibility, not prying into the lives of the people he served. Yet something inside him insisted that he couldn't simply walk away from this. The weight of that girl's fear, her silent plea, gnawed at his conscience, making it impossible to move on. As Arjun tied his apron and reported for his shift at Franco's pizzeria, he noticed Gerald watching him with a knowing look. "You seem distracted, kid," Gerald remarked, crossing his arms. Arjun shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Just couldn't sleep, I guess. Lots on my mind." Gerald studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is it about the delivery to Maple Street?" Arjun's heart skipped a beat. "Well, yeah, I guess. Something about that place didn't feel right." Gerald sighed deeply, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Look, kid, some people in this town, they're better off left alone. There's a lot going on that you can't fix by just being curious. Stick to your job, all right? You're here to deliver pizza, not to play hero." Arjun nodded, but his mind was already made up. Despite Gerald's warning, he couldn't let go of the feeling that Sophie needed help. He'd witnessed something that didn't sit right with him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't simply ignore it. An hour into his shift, Arjun's resolve was tested. The phone at the counter rang, and Gerald picked it up, scribbling down an order on his notepad. As he hung up, he glanced at Arjun, hesitation flickering across his face. "It's a delivery to 357 Maple Street. Small pepperoni pizza. "They're asking for you specifically," Gerald said, his tone unusually serious. Arjun's heart leaped into his throat. Someone from that house had called again, and they'd requested him. He quickly masked his surprise with a nod, taking the pizza box from Gerald's hands. Gerald's grip lingered for a moment, his gaze hard and piercing. "Remember what I told you, Arjun. Just deliver and go." Arjun nodded, feigning compliance, but his mind was racing. This was his chance to check on Sophie and, hopefully, get to the bottom of whatever was going on in that house. Taking a deep breath, he mounted his bike, the pizza balanced carefully under his arm, and set off toward Maple Street. The familiar path to Maple Street was eerily quiet, the once bustling streets now deserted. Arjun pedaled faster, feeling a growing sense of urgency. When he finally arrived, the house looked even more decrepit in the dull morning light, its chipped paint and sagging roof a reminder of how neglected it was. As Arjun dismounted his bike and approached the front door, he noticed that the windows were all tightly shut, curtains drawn against the world outside. The air around the house felt thick and heavy, as though the secrets it held were pressing outward, eager to be uncovered. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open a few inches, revealing Sophie's small, frightened face. She looked worse than before, her skin pale and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Her clothes, though the same as yesterday, were now stained and rumpled, as if she'd slept in them. "Hi, Sophie," Arjun said gently, holding out the pizza box. "I brought you your order." Sophie nodded, reaching out to take the pizza with a trembling hand. She clutched it tightly, as though it were a lifeline. Arjun could see that her hands were now scrubbed raw, pink and sore-looking, as though she'd tried desperately to wash away whatever stains had been there the day before. "Are you okay?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder into the dark hallway behind her before turning back to him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "My grandma. She's sick, really sick." The words slipped out, quiet and fragile, as though Sophie had been holding them in for too long. Arjun's heart twisted. He knew he should just nod, hand her the pizza, and leave. But something about the way she looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope, held him there. "Do you need any help?" he asked gently, lowering his voice to match hers. Sophie's gaze flickered with something close to relief, but then a shadow of fear crossed her face. She shook her head quickly. "No, it's okay. I can take care of her." Arjun glanced over her shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the house's interior. The darkness within seemed to swallow the faint light from the open door, making it impossible to see anything beyond the small entryway. But the stench from yesterday had returned, stronger than before, a sickly sweet mix of decay and bleach that made his stomach turn. "Sophie," he began cautiously, "is there anyone else here with you? Maybe someone who can help your grandma?" Her face fell, and her shoulders slumped as if the weight of his question was too much to bear. "No, it's just me and Grandma." Arjun's heart sank. He couldn't leave her alone like this, not when it was clear that she was struggling to keep things together. But how could he help without intruding on her privacy? He decided to take a risk. "Sophie, if it's all right with you, maybe I could just come in for a minute, just to see if there's anything I can do to help." Sophie's eyes widened, and she took a step back, hugging the pizza box to her chest. She glanced over her shoulder again, her expression a mixture of fear and longing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded, opening the door a little wider to let him in. Arjun stepped over the threshold, the oppressive smell hitting him like a wall. He covered his mouth and nose, trying not to gag as he took in the scene around him. The hallway was narrow, lined with stacks of newspapers, cardboard boxes, and broken furniture piled haphazardly. A thin layer of dust covered everything, as if the house had been abandoned long before it had started to decay. "Follow me," Sophie whispered, leading him deeper into the house. Arjun followed her through the narrow, winding paths between piles of clutter, his heart pounding. The further they went, the stronger the stench became, mingling with the musty smell of old wood and mildew. He glanced at Sophie, noticing the tension in her shoulders, the way she clutched the pizza box like a security blanket. They reached a small living room, its once cozy furniture now buried under layers of discarded clothing, blankets, and forgotten knickknacks. In the center of the room was a worn, sagging sofa, and on it lay an elderly woman, her eyes half closed and her skin a sickly pale. Sophie placed the pizza box on a small table and knelt beside the woman, her small hands trembling as she gently patted her grandmother's arm. "Grandma, I brought you food," she murmured, her voice soft and tender. The woman didn't respond, her breathing shallow and uneven. Arjun took a cautious step closer, feeling his heart ache as he watched Sophie struggle to care for her grandmother with such limited resources. Has she seen a doctor?" Arjun asked quietly. Sophie shook her head, biting her lip as she fought back tears. "I don't know what to do. She's been getting worse, and I can't leave her alone to get help." Arjun felt a surge of helplessness. This child had been carrying an impossible burden, trapped in a situation far beyond her control. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Not now, not when he'd seen firsthand the depth of her struggle. "Sophie," he said gently, "I can help you call someone. Maybe a doctor or someone who can come here and take a look at your grandma." Sophie shook her head vehemently, her face paling. "No, please. They'll take her away. They'll take me away. I don't want to be alone. I can't." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, stifling a sob. Arjun's heart shattered as he realized the depth of her fear, not just for her grandmother, but for herself. She was terrified of losing the only family she had left. "Sophie," he said softly, kneeling down beside her, "I understand you're scared, but maybe if we just ask for a little help, they won't separate you from her. I'll be here. I'll make sure they understand that you want to stay together." Sophie looked at him, hope and fear mingling in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but Arjun could see the wheels turning in her mind, the battle between her desperate need for help and her fear of the unknown. After a long silence, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "Okay," she whispered, "but please don't let them take her away." Arjun gave her a reassuring smile, though inside, his own fear simmered. He didn't know if he could keep that promise, but he would do everything in his power to try. As he pulled out his phone to make the call, he felt a surge of determination. Sophie had been alone in this nightmare for too long. It was time for someone to help her carry the weight, even if it meant risking everything to do so. A plea for help. Arjun's hands shook as he held the phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency number. He took a deep breath, glancing at Sophie, who was kneeling beside her grandmother's frail, motionless form. Her expression was a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion, a haunting look that stirred something deep within him. Arjun closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He knew this call could change everything for Sophie, but he had to believe that someone would listen, someone would understand and help without tearing her life apart. He dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" The calm, professional voice of the operator filled his ear, grounding him. Arjun spoke in a low, measured tone, doing his best to keep Sophie calm as he explained the situation. "I'm at 357 Maple Street. There's an elderly woman here, very ill, and in need of immediate medical attention. Her granddaughter has been caring for her alone. And, well, it's urgent. Please, just send someone who can help her here." "Understood, sir. An ambulance is on the way, along with social services to check on the child's welfare." The words social services sent a ripple of panic through Arjun, and he glanced at Sophie. She had heard it too, and her face drained of color, her small hands clutching at her grandmother's thin arm as if she could hold onto her family with sheer will. "Please, can you make a note?" Arjun said quickly. "The girl, she's scared of being separated from her grandmother. I think she just needs help caring for her, not to be taken away." Can you let them know that?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We'll inform the officers on scene. Please stay where you are until they arrive." Arjun thanked the operator, ending the call. As he put his phone back in his pocket, he looked over at Sophie, who was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "They're coming, Sophie. They'll help your grandma. I made sure to let them know that you want to stay with her." Sophie swallowed hard, her face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. She nodded, gripping her grandmother's hand tightly, as if afraid the old woman might vanish before help could arrive. The minutes felt like hours as they waited, the silence punctuated only by the shallow, uneven breaths of Sophie's grandmother, Evelyn. Arjun couldn't shake the feeling that every second counted, and he found himself glancing nervously toward the window, willing the ambulance to arrive faster. He looked around the room, noticing for the first time the deep layers of dust on the shelves and the faded photographs tucked into broken frames. In one, a younger, healthier Evelyn stood next to a tall, gray-haired man, smiling proudly as they held a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. The baby must have been Sophie. As he glanced at the other photos, he noticed that they all showed Evelyn, her husband, and Sophie. No parents. Arjun wondered briefly what had happened to them, but he decided not to ask. Sophie already seemed burdened with more than enough grief. He turned his attention back to Evelyn, who looked even paler now, her breaths slowing in a way that made Arjun's heart ache. He didn't know how long she had been sick, but it was clear that she hadn't received the care she needed. He realized that Sophie must have been doing everything in her power to keep her grandmother comfortable, but a child could only do so much. "Sophie," he said gently, sitting beside her on the floor. "How long has she been like this?" Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek and looked at him, her expression wary. "A few weeks. She used to get out of bed sometimes, but lately she just stays here. She keeps saying she'll get better, but I don't think she's getting better." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her small frame shaking with quiet sobs. Arjun's heart twisted, and he reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Sophie," he whispered. "You've done so much for her already. You're stronger than most people I know." Sophie lifted her head, her eyes red and puffy. She looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and sadness flickering across her face. I didn't want her to be alone. She's all I have." Arjun swallowed the lump in his throat, fighting back his own tears. He knew that Sophie had been living in a world of isolation and fear, carrying the weight of responsibility no child should bear alone. In that moment, he silently promised himself that he would stay by her side, no matter what happened next. The distant sound of sirens finally broke the silence, growing louder as they approached the house. Sophie's head jerked up, her eyes widening with fear and anticipation. She clutched Arjun's hand tightly, and he squeezed back, offering her a reassuring nod. "It's going to be okay," he murmured. "They're here to help." Moments later, the flashing lights of an ambulance and a police car cast eerie shadows through the dusty windows, illuminating the room in quick, rhythmic bursts. Arjun could feel Sophie's grip tighten as the door opened, and two paramedics entered, followed closely by a police officer and a social worker. The paramedics quickly moved to Evelyn's side, checking her pulse and vitals. Sophie's eyes were glued to her grandmother, her face a mask of worry and desperation. Arjun held her hand, whispering reassurances as the paramedics worked, hoping to calm her as much as he could. The social worker, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, knelt beside Sophie and Arjun. "Hello, Sophie," she said softly. "My name is Miss Carter. I'm here to make sure you're okay and to help your grandmother get the care she needs." Sophie looked at Miss Carter, her eyes wary but filled with a glimmer of hope. She didn't say anything, simply nodded, clutching Arjun's hand even tighter. Miss Carter glanced at Arjun, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Are you her friend?" Arjun nodded. "I work at Franco's Pizzeria. I delivered her pizza, and, well, I couldn't just walk away when I saw how things were." Miss Carter offered him a grateful smile. Thank you for staying with her. It means a lot. Arjun nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. In that moment, he realized that he had been exactly where he needed to be. One of the paramedics approached, her face grave. She's in critical condition. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. Sophie's face crumpled, and she turned to Arjun, her voice trembling. They're not taking her away forever, are they? Arjun knelt beside her, meeting her gaze with a look of fierce determination. No, Sophie. They're taking her so she can get better. And we're going to make sure you stay with her, okay? Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. After a long moment, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. As the paramedics carefully lifted Evelyn onto a stretcher, Ms. Carter placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. Would you like to ride with your grandmother to the hospital? Sophie nodded eagerly, her eyes filled with relief. Arjun watched as she climbed into the ambulance, her small hand holding her grandmother's fragile fingers. He felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness as he watched the ambulance doors close, knowing that he had done everything he could to help. Just as the ambulance began to pull away, the police officer approached Arjun, his gaze stern but not unkind. You did a good thing, son, he said, nodding approvingly. Not many people would have stayed, let alone called for help. Arjun shrugged, feeling a bit awkward. I couldn't leave her alone. She's been through enough. The officer nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Well, you did the right thing. If you hadn't called, who knows what might have happened. Arjun nodded, the weight of the day's events settling over him. He had stepped into a world of shadows and secrets, a place where one child's courage had been met with silence and neglect. But now, at least, she wouldn't be alone anymore. As he watched the ambulance disappear down the street, Arjun felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had given Sophie a chance, a lifeline she desperately needed. And he knew, deep down, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the strength and resilience she had shown him that day. With a final glance toward Maple Street, Arjun turned and walked back to his bike, feeling lighter than he had in days. He knew that he would never forget Sophie, nor the kindness and courage she had shown in the face of such unimaginable hardship. And as he rode back to Franco's pizzeria, the sun breaking through the clouds above, Arjun couldn't help but feel that he had made a difference, however small, in a world that too often turned a blind eye to those who needed help the most. The secrets of Maple Street. The steady hum of hospital machinery filled the sterile room where Evelyn lay, her face pale against the stark white sheets. Sophie sat by her bedside, her small hand gripping her grandmother's fragile fingers as if afraid to let go. Arjun sat quietly beside her, a steady presence that had become Sophie's anchor in a storm of uncertainty. The doctors had stabilized Evelyn, but her condition was delicate. They informed Arjun and Sophie that the next few days would be critical. The illness that had ravaged her body had gone untreated for too long, leaving her weak and vulnerable. The hospital staff was compassionate but wary, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and concern whenever they looked at Sophie. The social worker, Miss Carter, had been true to her word, advocating fiercely to ensure that Sophie would remain with her grandmother. But there were complications. No one could locate Sophie's parents, and the family's records were sparse, leaving the authorities to assume Evelyn was her only guardian. While Sophie was permitted to stay with Evelyn in the hospital, questions about her home life lingered, and Arjun sensed that their challenges were far from over. As night fell, the soft beeping of monitors became the only sound in the room. Evelyn lay still, her breaths shallow and labored. Arjun had offered to stay with Sophie, not wanting her to face this alone, and Miss Carter had quietly approved. Exhausted from the emotional strain of the day, Sophie drifted off to sleep in her chair, her hand still clutching her grandmother's. Arjun looked at her, his heart aching for everything she'd endured. He'd barely known her for 2 days, yet he felt fiercely protective, as if he'd been entrusted with her care. He couldn't shake the image of her struggling to care for her grandmother alone in that dark, cluttered house, her small frame weighed down by responsibilities far beyond her years. As he sat beside her, watching over her as she slept, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Miss Carter, her face a mixture of worry and determination. "Arjun, can I speak to you outside?" she whispered, nodding toward the hallway. Arjun gently released Sophie's hand from his grip and followed Miss Carter out into the corridor. The hospital was quiet, the only sounds the faint murmur of voices and the distant clatter of carts. Once they were alone, Miss Carter's expression grew serious. "Thank you for staying with her. I know this has been difficult for you, but I believe Sophie feels safer with you here." Arjun nodded, grateful that Miss Carter recognized the bond he'd formed with Sophie. "I just want to make sure she's okay. She's been through so much, and it feels wrong to leave her alone." Miss Carter smiled softly, though her eyes were tinged with sadness. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been looking into Sophie's background, trying to understand her family situation. But, well, things aren't adding up." Arjun's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Carter glanced back toward the hospital room, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "It seems that Sophie's parents haven't been in her life for quite some time. The records indicate that they were involved in some legal trouble years ago, but there's no mention of where they are now. Evelyn took full guardianship of Sophie after that, but from what I can tell, they've been living in extreme isolation." Arjun swallowed, memories of the eerie, decaying house on Maple Street flooding back. That explains a lot. The house, it felt like it hadn't been touched in years. Sophie mentioned that it's just been her and her grandmother for a long time. Miss Carter sighed, her face etched with concern. "Evelyn's condition is severe, Arjun. Even if she pulls through, she may not be able to care for Sophie. And without other family members, Sophie may be placed into foster care." Arjun felt a pang of dread. He looked back at the door, imagining Sophie waking up to a life without the only family she had. There has to be another option. She's already lost so much. Miss Carter nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There might be, but it would require a lot of work. And we would need to find someone who is willing to step in for Sophie, someone she trusts." The unspoken implication hung in the air, and Arjun felt his heart race. He had only just met Sophie, yet he couldn't imagine leaving her to face this alone. He looked at Miss Carter, a silent question in his eyes. "Would you consider helping her, Arjun?" Miss Carter asked gently. "I'm not suggesting you become her guardian, at least not right away. But if you're willing, you could provide stability, a familiar face, while we work out a long-term plan. She's been through enough trauma, and the thought of her going into a stranger's home." Arjun took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He knew this was a huge responsibility, one that he hadn't anticipated when he took the job at Franco's Pizzeria. But he also knew he couldn't walk away now. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever I can to help her." Miss Carter's expression softened, and she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Arjun. I'll work on the paperwork and see if we can arrange something temporary. I'll also keep looking for any extended family, just in case." Arjun nodded, a newfound sense of purpose filling him. He would be there for Sophie, no matter what. The following day was a blur of doctors' visits and whispered conversations. Sophie remained by her grandmother's side, her face a mixture of hope and fear, as if afraid to let herself believe that Evelyn might recover. Miss Carter visited frequently, her presence a calming influence in the chaos. In the quiet moments between hospital staff visits, Arjun and Sophie talked, their conversations an unexpected source of comfort for both. He learned more about her life on Maple Street, the long, lonely days spent caring for her grandmother, the stories Evelyn would tell her about their family's past. "She always says that the world is a tough place," Sophie confided one afternoon, her eyes distant. "She told me to be strong, to be ready for anything. But it's hard, Arjun. Sometimes I wish I didn't have to be so strong." Arjun's heart ached for her. He reached out, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. You're stronger than you know, Sophie, but you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." A faint smile touched her lips, and for the first time since he'd met her, Arjun saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. On the third day, Evelyn's condition took a turn. The doctors informed them that she had stabilized enough to be transferred to a rehabilitation facility, where she could receive the long-term care she needed. But the news was bittersweet. Evelyn's weakened state meant that she might not fully recover, and the uncertainty of her prognosis weighed heavily on everyone. As the hospital staff prepared Evelyn for the transfer, Miss Carter pulled Arjun and Sophie aside, her face solemn. "Sophie," she said gently, kneeling to meet the girl's gaze, "your grandmother is going to a place where she'll have the best possible care. And while she's there, we're going to make sure you're safe and taken care of too." Sophie's face fell, her eyes filling with tears. "I want to go with her. I don't want to be alone." Ms. Carter glanced at Arjun, then back at Sophie. "You won't be alone, sweetheart. Arjun is here, and he's agreed to help you while we work on a plan. You can stay with him for now, and we'll make sure you're able to visit your grandmother." Sophie looked at Arjun, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. "Really? You'd take care of me?" Arjun smiled, reaching out to brush a tear from her cheek. "Of course, Sophie. You're not alone anymore. We'll get through this together." She threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. Arjun held her close, feeling a surge of protectiveness unlike anything he'd ever known. He'd walked into her life as a stranger, but now he was determined to be the family she needed. The following week was a whirlwind of adjustments. Sophie moved in with Arjun, who had quickly prepared his small apartment to make it as welcoming as possible. It was a modest space, but he took pride in making sure Sophie felt at home. He set up a cozy bed for her in the corner of the living room, surrounding it with soft blankets and pillows, hoping to bring her some comfort in this new environment. Every day after work, they would visit Evelyn at the rehabilitation center, bringing her small gifts and updates from home. Arjun watched as Sophie slowly grew more comfortable, her laughter returning in small bursts as they shared stories and memories together. One evening, as they sat by Evelyn's bedside, the old woman reached out, her frail hand clasping Arjun's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for taking care of my girl." Arjun felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It's my honor, Evelyn. She's a wonderful kid. You've done an amazing job raising her." Evelyn smiled weakly, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "She's all I have left. Promise me you'll look out for her." Arjun nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "I promise." As he looked at Sophie, who was sitting beside him, a newfound determination settled within him. He realized that he had been given a rare and precious responsibility, one that he would carry with all his heart. In the weeks that followed, Arjun and Sophie grew closer, their bond deepening with every shared meal, every late-night talk, every visit to Evelyn. They became each other's family, a source of strength and solace in a world that had once felt so lonely. And as Arjun looked at Sophie, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the evening light, he knew that he had found a purpose far greater than anything he'd ever imagined. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, bound by a promise and a love that had turned strangers into family. An unbreakable bond. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet rhythm of daily life settled around Arjun and Sophie like a protective cocoon. Every morning, Arjun would wake early, preparing breakfast for Sophie before she went to school. They had established a routine. He would work his shift at Franco's pizzeria during the day, and each evening they would visit Evelyn at the rehabilitation center. Despite the small space in his apartment, Arjun had managed to create a cozy corner for Sophie, surrounding her with books, blankets, and small comforts that he hoped made her feel safe. The changes in Sophie were subtle but significant. Her once wary gaze softened, her shoulders no longer slumped under an invisible weight. She laughed more often now, a sound that filled Arjun's heart with warmth. She had even taken to calling him Uncle Arjun, a term that left him grinning each time she used it. Slowly, she was beginning to believe that she could trust again, that this newfound family wasn't just a fleeting dream. One crisp autumn afternoon, after finishing a delivery shift, Arjun arrived home to find Sophie waiting eagerly at the window. She rushed to open the door, her face lit up with excitement. "Uncle Arjun, guess what?" she exclaimed, her eyes bright. Arjun chuckled, setting his delivery bag aside. "What's got you so excited, Soph?" She held out a piece of paper, a brightly colored flyer advertising a school science fair. "My teacher told me about this. She said we could make a project and bring it to school to show everyone." Arjun took the flyer, reading it over carefully. "A science fair, huh? That sounds pretty amazing. Do you have any ideas?" Sophie bit her lip, her excitement fading just a bit. "I thought maybe I could build something. Like a robot, maybe, but I don't have all the parts, and I don't know if I could really make it work." Arjun crouched down, meeting her gaze. "Hey, if that's what you want to do, then we'll figure it out together. We can make it happen." Sophie's face lit up with hope, and she threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug. "Thank you, Uncle Arjun. I'm so glad you're here." As they planned the project over dinner, Arjun couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. Despite the difficulties they'd both faced, they had found each other, forming a family in the most unlikely of circumstances. The days leading up to the science fair were a whirlwind of activity. Arjun took every spare moment to help Sophie gather materials, scouring hardware stores, and even asking friends for spare parts. They transformed his small living room into a makeshift workshop, the floor strewn with wires, bolts, and bits of old appliances that Sophie had disassembled with meticulous care. Each evening, they would work side by side, Sophie's brow furrowed in concentration as she assembled the robot's tiny arms and legs. Arjun guided her as best as he could, marveling at her natural curiosity and determination. Sophie's confidence grew with each piece she added, her eyes lighting up as the robot began to take shape. One evening, as they worked on the robot's wiring, Sophie paused, glancing at Arjun with a hesitant look. "Uncle Arjun, do you think my grandma would be proud of me?" Arjun set down his tools, meeting her gaze with a gentle smile. "Soph, she'd be more than proud. She'd be amazed at what you've accomplished. You're doing something incredible." A shy smile touched her lips, and she turned back to the robot, a newfound determination in her eyes. Their hard work paid off. By the time the science fair arrived, Sophie had created a small but functional robot that could roll forward and lift tiny objects with its mechanical arms. She named it Robo-Buddy, and as they loaded it into Arjun's car, she beamed with pride. At the school, Sophie's project was an instant hit. Children and parents crowded around her table, marveling at the little robot as it picked up small blocks and waved its mechanical arms. Arjun watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride as he saw Sophie blossom under the attention and praise. As they packed up to leave, Sophie ran back to him, her face flushed with excitement. "Uncle Arjun, I can't believe it. They actually liked it." Arjun laughed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Of course they did. You worked so hard on it. Soph, you should be proud of yourself." She looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I'd do without you." Arjun swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. He ruffled her hair gently. "You don't ever have to worry about that. I'm here, no matter what." That night, as they visited Evelyn at the rehabilitation center, Sophie eagerly recounted every detail of the science fair, describing the robot's success with a level of excitement that brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. The older woman lay in her bed, frail but attentive, her hand resting on Sophie's as she listened to each story. "Oh, Sophie," Evelyn murmured, her voice filled with emotion. "You've grown so much. I'm so proud of you." Sophie smiled, leaning into her grandmother's gentle embrace. For the first time, Arjun noticed that Evelyn's face, once drawn and weary, seemed to glow with a quiet contentment. She glanced at Arjun, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've been a blessing to us, Arjun," she said softly, reaching out to hold his hand. "I don't know how to thank you." Arjun shook his head, humbled by her words. "I haven't done anything special, Evelyn. I wanted to make sure Sophie had someone to lean on." Evelyn's gaze held his strong and unwavering. "You've done more than that. You've given her a family." The words struck Arjun deeply, and he felt a swell of emotion rise within him. He had never expected to become a father figure, let alone for a girl like Sophie, but in that moment he realized just how much she had come to mean to him. She was no longer just a child he'd helped on a whim. She was a part of his life, a part of his heart. A few weeks later, Evelyn's health began to deteriorate again. The doctors did everything they could, but her age and frailty made recovery a distant hope. Arjun and Sophie spent every spare moment at her bedside, offering comfort and support as she grew weaker each day. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the room, Evelyn beckoned Arjun closer. She was pale, her breaths shallow, but her eyes held a clarity that Arjun hadn't seen in weeks. "Arjun," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I need to ask you one last favor." He leaned in, his heart heavy. "Anything, Evelyn." Her gaze shifted to Sophie, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, clutching her grandmother's hand. "Promise me, you'll take care of her. She's been through so much. She deserves a life filled with love and kindness." Arjun's throat tightened, and he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise, Evelyn. I'll look after her. She won't be alone." Evelyn's eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips. "Thank you for giving her the family I couldn't." With a final, shaky breath, Evelyn closed her eyes, her hand slipping from Arjun's grasp. A deep silence filled the room, the stillness settling over them like a heavy blanket. Arjun felt a wave of grief wash over him, his heart breaking for the young girl who had lost the one person who had always been there for her. He reached out, wrapping an arm around Sophie, pulling her close as he tried to shield her from the pain that was yet to come. As Sophie stirred, waking to find her grandmother gone, she let out a heart-wrenching sob, her small body trembling with the force of her grief. Arjun held her tightly, whispering words of comfort, his own tears mingling with hers. "We'll get through this together, Sophie," he murmured, his voice steady despite the pain. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie clung to him, her grief raw and unfiltered, and in that moment, they became more than just a makeshift family. They became each other's lifeline, bound by loss but strengthened by love. In the days that followed Evelyn's passing, Arjun dedicated himself to caring for Sophie, honoring the promise he had made. He navigated the challenges of legal guardianship, working closely with Ms. Carter to ensure that Sophie could stay with him permanently. The process was long and complicated, but Arjun faced each hurdle with unwavering resolve, determined to give Sophie the stability she deserved. The grief lingered, but together, they found ways to heal. Arjun would tell Sophie stories about his own mother, sharing memories that had once felt too painful to revisit. In turn, Sophie would talk about Evelyn, recounting her favorite stories and traditions, keeping her grandmother's memory alive. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and as the seasons changed, so did they. They built a life together, a family forged from loss and resilience, learning that love could bloom even in the darkest of times. One evening, as they sat together on the small balcony of Arjun's apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Uncle Arjun," she said softly, "do you think Grandma can see us?" Arjun wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I think she can, Soph. And I think she's proud of you. Of both of us." They sat in silence, watching the stars, finding peace in each other's presence. They were no longer just two lost souls who had crossed paths by chance. They were family, bound by promises, by shared memories, and by a love that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. And as they faced the future together, Arjun knew that he had been given the greatest gift of all, a family of his own, and a second chance to build a life filled with love, hope, and unbreakable bonds. A family forged in love. Autumn gave way to winter, and as the chill of the season settled over Milltown, Arjun and Sophie's life settled into a new rhythm. The nights were colder and the city's pace seemed to slow as holiday lights began to twinkle in shop windows, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. Despite the changes outside, the bond between Arjun and Sophie had become a warm, unbreakable force that insulated them from the harshness of the world. Together, they had carved out a place of peace, resilience, and hope. Sophie had adjusted to her new life with Arjun in ways that surprised even her. She was thriving at school, and her teachers often commented on her creativity and intelligence. Her robot from the science fair still sat proudly on the small shelf Arjun had built for her, a reminder of the pride and confidence she'd gained. It was a little rickety and sometimes fell over, but to Sophie, it represented so much more than a school project. It was a symbol of her strength and the family she had found with Arjun. As the days grew shorter, the first holiday season without Evelyn loomed ahead, casting a shadow over their lives. Both Arjun and Sophie could feel the absence of Evelyn's warmth and presence, especially as Christmas approached. But rather than dwell on the sorrow, they found ways to honor her memory. One chilly December evening, Arjun and Sophie were decorating their small apartment with paper snowflakes and strands of colorful lights they'd picked up from the dollar store. As Sophie strung the lights around the windows, her face lit up with excitement, even as her eyes held a trace of sadness. "Uncle Arjun," she said, her voice soft, "do you think Grandma would like this? The lights, I mean." Arjun paused, looking at her with a gentle smile. "I think she'd love it, Soph. She'd be so proud of everything you've done to make this place feel like home." Sophie gave a small nod, her expression thoughtful. "She used to tell me stories about how she and Grandpa would decorate their house for Christmas. She'd put up a big wreath on the front door and bake cookies every night in December. Sometimes she'd even let me decorate the cookies with her." Arjun's heart ached as he watched her try to hold onto those precious memories. He knew he couldn't replace Evelyn, but he was determined to make this holiday season a meaningful one for Sophie. "Hey, why don't we bake some cookies this weekend?" he suggested, his eyes brightening with the thought. "We can even make a wreath for the door if you'd like. We'll do it just like Grandma did." Sophie's face lit up, a genuine smile breaking through her sadness. "Really? You'd help me do that?" Arjun nodded, feeling his own excitement build. "Of course. We're family, remember? We'll make new traditions together, just the way Evelyn would have wanted." That weekend, they turned the kitchen into a whirlwind of flour, sugar, and laughter as they baked batches of cookies, experimenting with different shapes and decorations. Arjun had never been much of a baker, but Sophie guided him, showing him the tricks Evelyn had taught her. They made snowmen, stars, and little hearts, icing each one with care. Sophie's giggles filled the room as Arjun tried, and failed, to make a perfect snowflake cookie, his attempts ending up as wonky blobs that they both pretended were modern art. In the evenings, they sat by the window, looking out at the city as snowflakes drifted down in soft, delicate patterns. Arjun had strung lights around the small Christmas tree they'd found, and their cozy apartment sparkled with a warmth that felt like an embrace. As Christmas Eve approached, Arjun planned a surprise for Sophie, wanting to make her first holiday without Evelyn as special as possible. He'd saved up enough to buy her a few gifts, things she'd mentioned wanting over the past few months. She'd always loved science and had a growing interest in building things, so he bought her a beginner's robotics kit, along with a couple of new books and some art supplies. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged gifts in the glow of the tree lights. Sophie's eyes lit up as she unwrapped the robotics kit, her face filled with joy and surprise. "Uncle Arjun, this is amazing." she exclaimed, hugging the box to her chest. "I can't believe you remembered." Arjun grinned, his heart swelling with happiness. "Of course I did. I know how much you love building things, Soph. I thought maybe this could be the start of a new project." Sophie hugged him tightly, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Thank you, Uncle Arjun. This is the best Christmas ever." In that moment, Arjun felt a profound sense of purpose. He realized that he wasn't just caring for Sophie, he was helping her build a future, one filled with dreams and possibilities. He had become the family she needed, and she had filled a space in his heart he hadn't known was empty. The holiday season passed, but the bond between Arjun and Sophie only grew stronger. She had come to rely on him as more than just a guardian. He was her friend, her mentor, and her unwavering support. In turn, she brought a joy to his life that he had never expected, a sense of belonging that had been missing since he lost his mother. One chilly evening in late January, as they sat by the window, Sophie looked at him with a serious expression. "Uncle Arjun, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice hesitant. "Of course, Soph. Anything." She bit her lip, looking down at her hands. "Do you think I could ever call you Dad? I know you're not really my dad, but you feel like family. And I'd like to call you that, if it's okay with you." Arjun felt a lump rise in his throat, his heart pounding as he took in her words. He hadn't expected this, hadn't realized just how deeply their bond had grown for Sophie as well. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears as he looked at her. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice choked with emotion, "it would be the greatest honor of my life to be called your dad." Sophie's face broke into a radiant smile, and she hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around him with a fierceness that spoke to the love and trust they had built together. In that moment, Arjun felt complete in a way he hadn't thought possible. He had found his family, not through blood but through love, resilience, and an unbreakable bond. From that day on, Sophie called him Dad, the word filling their small apartment with a warmth that pushed away any lingering sadness or doubt. They continued to build their life together, each new day bringing its own challenges and joys. Arjun worked hard, balancing his job with the responsibilities of being a father, but he embraced every moment with gratitude and pride. As winter turned to spring, Sophie continued to thrive, her curiosity and intelligence blossoming in school. She had become known as the science whiz among her classmates, and she often brought home projects that filled their living room with experiments and inventions. Arjun encouraged her every step of the way, marveling at her creativity and determination. One sunny afternoon, as they walked through the park, Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, "I know Grandma's watching over us. I can feel it sometimes, like she's still here with us." Arjun nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think you're right, Soph. She's with us in every memory, every story, and every moment we spend together. She'd be so proud of the person you're becoming." Sophie smiled, leaning into him as they continued their walk, the sun casting a warm glow over them. They had come a long way from the lonely, broken lives they had once led. Together, they had built a family rooted in love and resilience, a family that Evelyn would have been proud of. As they walked, Arjun realized that he had found his purpose, not just as Sophie's guardian, but as her father, her protector, and her friend. The road ahead would have its challenges, but he knew they would face each one with strength and courage, united by a bond that nothing could break. And as they strolled through the park, hand in hand, he felt a peace settle over him, a peace that only family, in its truest and most beautiful form, could bring.